Chakras are the vortexes of energy. They are the wheels of energy which carry information from a much subtler realm into the realm of where matter is being formed. So basically, chakras, as the wheels of energy, are various degrees with which consciousness expresses itself through various planes of its existence down to the elemental order. And when we talk about the human being, according to certain traditions which dealt with that phenomena in great depth and with profound clarity and understanding, that the whole human being is like the reflection of the light of consciousness, whereby that pure light breaks through the prism of human organism, and thence it is not different from consciousness in the first place, but it allows consciousness to experience itself as a living, pulsating human form, or whatever you would like to sort of compare it with. So what are the chakras in essence? Obviously there are many books, there are a lot of information on this subject. However, to understand it properly, chakras, and what we've mentioned just now, this is the basic principle. This is the principle of the spiritual anatomy, so to speak. However, in its subtlety and its complexity, chakras, while there is this certain degree of vibration, and each chakra is respectively associated with a particular elemental order, like let's say starting from the throat chakra downward, which correlates to the ether, air, fire, water, and earth. The 5 elements which form this entire sort of creation as a form, perceivable, through 5 senses, which in turn also interlinked with this whole orchestration. The sensory perceptions are intimately linked to 5 elements. But in relation to the chakras themselves, during that process of projection, there is a certain information which, let's say, in Oriental traditions known as karma, is being mixed, and each chakra carries a certain impression inherent to a particular embodied form, which then keeps reincarnating time after time again into the, let's say, whatever the formation that takes place. It could be human formation, could be plant formation, animal formation, rock formation, what have you, whereby that principle of reincarnation is being directed from the or by the agency of karmic inheritance. So, but karma in itself is much subtler than the subtle realm made of psychic wheels of the chakras. And yet, each chakra is a repository of certain psychic impressions, and thence each chakra is associated to a certain element. It is there where a certain impression, as I said, psychic impression, is being projected into a physical form through the physical organism, whereby individual enjoys and basically finds himself or herself in that embodied individuality with all its information. So what happens to the one in whom consciousness awakens from its dormant state and goes through the gradual process of expansion? And when we say gradual process of expansion, it could take minutes, and it could take years, decades, lifetimes. It's not the process which we can kind of like narrow down to a certain number of years and what have you, because it's all individually bound and subject to the capacity of the nervous system to withstand that process. The question itself comes from the place of direct experience, and the question is asking what happens to the chakras, when they break apart. Well, that is precisely what happens to the process of expansion. As the prana, as the awakened prana, is generating enough power to move outward of a place where it has been basically coiled, it expands, and as it enters the subtle channels in the body, the whole body undergoes the process of purification. And when this awakened prana gets in touch with any particular psychic will or chakra, what it does, it reactivates that energetic center, first of all. It reactivates that energetic center, and the energetic center in turn releases all this psychic information which has been stored there for God knows how long. And the one who undergoes that experience often goes through all these psychic phenomena associated with each particular psychic will. But what happens to the chakra after this process of purification takes place? Once all the information has been processed, that nothing holds that psychic will anymore in its place, because there's no information left. The information has been processed, and the tradition speaks of the lotus basically drops its petals down, as it were. It served its purpose, and it's no longer required. Some people get this as if, how come? Like, what happens to the individuality then? What happens to the being? Does it mean that his chakras are collapsing and he's like a walking hollow? He's like a dead walking man? Not at all. On the contrary, when that happens, that in itself constitutes the coming out of the cycle of birth and rebirth. This annihilates this whole store of psychic repository. It dissolves all the psychic impressions through various centers, and there is nothing that will prompt that body, that embodied soul, to reincarnate again into another flesh. Now, and again, this is just a general picture, and obviously one cannot generalize it to the degree of certain prescriptions. Everyone will experience this process in his or her own right and in accord with individual conditioning. For instance, someone may have tremendous amount of repository at the lower chakras and will spend a lot of time dealing or going through that process, and yet once that is being digested, so to speak, the prana, Shakti, awakened prana, is then moved without any abstraction to higher regions and renders that individual into what we call, so to speak, in the human language, a state of enlightenment, state of emancipation. Or it could happen the other way around. The psychic impressions could be much stronger in the higher chakras, in the higher regions, right? And the early stage could be followed by a very gradual process of purification, and yet then slow down and take many years for that individual to go through the process of digesting and dissolving his or her own impressions, because that life force, that prana shakti, is obviously not separate from our essential being. It is the process which happens to itself, by itself, in its own accord. That experience of the chakras being basically releasing the light, releasing the sound, releasing certain psychic experiences, is actually very well recorded in yogic lore, in tantric lore, and clinically has been observed and partially documented in the Western literature since the 70s and the 80s. There are some accounts, one can look into them, to make greater sense of this whole experience. From my direct experience, is that the process is not necessarily a painful one. The process can take many various forms, and when people have these questions like, is it painful, let's say, when the heart chakra is being pierced? Well, let's not make a mistake. The word pierced here does not necessarily mean piercing something like piercing the flesh, where the obvious reaction is accompanied, the event accompanied with a certain pain associated with that. Piercing here, literally a metaphor, a way of the language of expressing something which is exceptionally and extremely subtle. That process of energy as life force going through various psychic centers is often felt like piercing of a certain center, simply because of that nature of the spiritual anatomy. And then everything set in motion. The reactivation of a psychic will, the release of information, the procession of that information, and then a release of that information, and the energy is ready to carry on through its various other stages. So, and there are some obviously gifted beings in whom this process happens in an extremely collapsed length of time, through extremely short period of time. When there's very little psychic information to process, obviously it could actually happen in one event, in one kind of burst of that energy, but that is exceptionally rare. The likelihood that most of us now have to deal with, quite an amount of information is self-evident, because that's the age we live in, and that's the state of collective consciousness. Like very few individuals came into this world who have inherited the state of consciousness which is way above the prevalent vibrations. But that is changing, So this is how I see this process in its kind of most direct and natural way.